December 18th, 1972, 7:53 p.m. local time, 32,000 feet above the Gulf of Tonkin. Captain Bob Certain gripped the yoke of his B-52G Stratofortress as the massive 8-engine bomber climbed through the darkness toward Hanoi. Below him, through breaks in the clouds, he could see the moonlight reflecting off the South China Sea. In his headset, he heard the steady chatter of hundreds of aircraft converging on North Vietnam's capital from 3 different directions. What Certain didn't know, what none of the 129 B-52 crews launching that night from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and Utapao Royal Thai Air Base knew was that they were about to fly into the most sophisticated, dense, and lethal air defense system ever created. A defensive network that had been studying them for months, waiting for them above Hanoi. 145 Soviet-built MiG fighters stood ready. Below, 26 SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile sites bristled with 300 missiles, their fan-zone radars powered up and tracking. Soviet military advisors manned many of the control vans, eager to test their weapons against America's ultimate conventional weapon. Over 3,000 anti-aircraft artillery pieces, ranging from 23mm to 130mm, pointed skyward. An overlapping radar network, recently upgraded with new fire control systems, created an invisible web of detection from which nothing could hide. The North Vietnamese Air Defense Command had been preparing for this moment since October. They had analyzed hundreds of hours of radar film showing B-52 electronic countermeasures patterns. They had produced a training manual titled How to Fight the B-52 and distributed it to every SA-2 unit. They knew the bombers' altitudes, their jamming frequencies, their standard tactics from 8 years of arc-light operations in South Vietnam and Laos. Major Bill Stocker, leading row cell in the first wave, checked his instruments. His B-52D, one of the oldest in the fleet at 17 years of service, carried 108 500-pound bombs in its massive belly. Behind him, stretched across hundreds of miles of sky, 99 more Stratofortresses follow in carefully spaced 3-ship cells. Each cell bore a color code: red, blue, cherry, slate, ebony, quilt, brass, charcoal. At precisely 7:54 p.m., EB-66 destroyer electronic warfare aircraft began jamming North Vietnamese radar frequencies. 4 Phantom II. Fighters laid corridors of metallic chaff, 60 miles long, 5 to 7 miles wide, to confuse enemy radar. F-111 aardvarks struck 6 airfields to keep MiGs grounded, and then the B-52s came. What the North Vietnamese defenders didn't fully understand was that these were not the predictable arc-light missions they had studied. The Americans had changed everything: the altitude, the routes, the tactics, the timing. What the Americans didn't understand was that Strategic Air Command Headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, 7,000 miles away, had ordered tactics so rigid, so predictable, so fundamentally flawed that they would transform routine bombing runs into a gauntlet of death. The mathematics of disaster were already written in both command centers. Hanoi's missile crews had calculated the perfect firing solutions. SAC's planners had created the perfect targets. Within 3 days, the illusion of American air supremacy would shatter like the canopy of a bomber tumbling from 32,000 feet. Within 11 days, the outcome of the Vietnam War would be decided not on the ground in South Vietnam, but in the skies above North Vietnam's capital. This is the story of Operation Linebacker II. The Christmas bombings, the 11 days, the last and largest strategic bombing campaign of the Vietnam War, the moment when the unstoppable force met the immovable object, and the remarkable transformation that followed. On March 2nd, 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began with a whisper when it should have been a roar. The first mission targeted 2 minor installations just north of the demilitarized zone, separating North and South Vietnam, an ammunition depot at Ac Sang Bang, 10 miles north of the DMZ, and a naval base at Quang Ke, 65 miles away. Air Force F-105, Thunder Chiefs F-1-200 Super Sabres, and B-57 Canberras struck with precision. The mission was technically successful. it was also strategically meaningless. Ambassador Maxwell D. Taylor, himself a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, watched from Saigon and expressed immediate doubt. "I doubt," he wrote in a cable to Washington, "that Hanoi was impressed." He was right. What Taylor witnessed was the operational manifestation of a strategic philosophy that would define and doom American air operations for the next 3 years. President Lyndon B. Johnson and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara had embraced a doctrine called gradualism. The theory was elegant in its conception. By slowly increasing pressure on North Vietnam through carefully calibrated bombing strikes, Washington could signal American resolve while maintaining control over escalation. The enemy would see the writing on the wall and negotiate. In practice, gradualism became a straitjacket that bound American air power in chains of its own making. From the beginning, Washington dictated which targets would be struck, on which day, at which hour, with which aircraft, carrying which ordnance, approaching from which direction. Airstrikes were strictly forbidden within 30 nautical miles of Hanoi and 10 nautical miles of the port of Haiphong. Key parts of North Vietnam were completely off limits. The Chinese buffer zone along the northern border, major airfields where MiG fighters sat invulnerable on their runways, shipyards where Soviet vessels unloaded war material, power plants that lit Hanoi's nights, oil storage facilities that fueled the entire war effort. The Air Force and Navy flew the missions. Washington fought the war. Colonel Robin Knowles, the legendary fighter ace, would later describe the frustration. "We were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, one eye closed, and one leg in the cast. The enemy had sanctuaries we couldn't touch. They knew exactly when and where we were coming. It was insane." The numbers tell the story of Rolling Thunder's strategic incoherence. From March 2, 1965 to November 1, 1968, American forces flew 304,000 fighter sorties and 2,380 B-52 sorties over North Vietnam. They dropped 643,000 tons of ordnance. They lost 900 aircraft valued at nearly $900 million. 113 American prisoners of war died in captivity. 65 tortured to death by interrogators seeking propaganda confessions. And at the end of 3 years and 8 months, North Vietnam's capacity to wage war was largely intact. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the vast network of paths, roads, and waterways through which Hanoi supplied communist forces in South Vietnam, continued to flow. Mobile anti-aircraft batteries moved freely, anticipating American strikes based on easily detectable patterns. Industrial facilities dispersed or moved underground. Oil stocks scattered across the country in 190-liter drums, making them nearly impossible to destroy from the air. Earl H. Tilford Jr., writing in the Encyclopedia of the Vietnam War, captured the consensus view. Rolling Thunder stands as the classic example of air power failure. A Senate Armed Services Subcommittee that investigated the campaign in August 1967 reached a different but equally damning conclusion: that the air campaign has not achieved its objectives to a greater extent cannot be attributed to inability or impotence of air power. It attests rather to the fragmentation of our air might by overly restrictive controls, limitations, and the doctrine of gradualism placed on our aviation forces. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress was never supposed to be in Vietnam. Conceived in the late 1940s and entering service in 1955, the massive 8-engine bomber was designed for one purpose: to deliver thermonuclear weapons deep into the Soviet Union at high altitude and high speed. Its 185-foot wingspan could carry 70,000 pounds of nuclear ordnance. A 6-man crew trained endlessly for the mission they prayed they would never fly, the apocalyptic strike that would incinerate Soviet cities and end civilization as humanity knew it. Then reality intervened. Intercontinental ballistic missiles made high-altitude penetration bombing obsolete. Surface-to-air missiles made high-altitude anything suicidal. The B-52's intended enemy, the Soviet Union, remained off-limits as Cold War dynamics constrained direct confrontation. And so, America's ultimate strategic weapon found itself repurposed for tactical warfare in Southeast Asia. The B-52's transformation from nuclear deterrent to conventional bomber began hesitantly. In June 1965, B-52F models from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam flew the first arc-light missions, carpet bombing suspected Viet Cong concentrations in South Vietnam. The concept was simple. Fill the B-52's cavernous bomb bay with conventional iron bombs. Fly at 30,000 feet above the range of small arms fire and obliterate everything within a box, measuring 1 mile by 2 miles. The psychological effect was devastating. The physical roar of 8 turbofan engines preceded the bombers by minutes. Then the bombs arrived, cascading down in strings of destruction that could be heard and felt for miles. Jungle canopy vanished, earth erupted, man and material simply ceased to exist. Survivors emerged from the bombardment shell-shocked, their eardrums burst, their will to fight shattered. But South Vietnam was not the problem. Hanoi was the problem, and Hanoi was protected by political restrictions more impenetrable than any steel armor. Throughout Rolling Thunder, B-52s were prohibited from striking targets in the North Vietnamese heartland. President Johnson restricted their use to the staging areas of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the Panhandle north of the DMZ. The bombers that could carry 20 tons of ordnance and fly for thousands of miles without refueling were reduced to interdicting jungle supply routes. It was using a sledgehammer to perform surgery. A few B-52 missions did venture into North Vietnam's southern panhandle starting in September 1966 with Operation Tally Ho. By May 1967, North Vietnamese SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missiles had moved south, hoping to down one of the massive bombers and claim a propaganda victory. Throughout 1967 and 1968, they tried. Several B-52s sustained damage, none fell from the sky. Yet, the North Vietnamese were learning. Every radar return, every jamming frequency, every flight path, every bomb run, all of it was recorded, studied, analyzed. Soviet advisors brought technical expertise. Vietnamese missile crews brought patience and determination. Together, they built a database of American tactics, particularly the predictable patterns of arc-light operations, where B-52s attack targets along consistent routes at consistent altitudes with consistent electronic countermeasures. In October 1972, air defense commanders gathered in Hanoi for a conference. They reviewed hundreds of feet of fan-zone and spoon-rest radar film showing B-52 jamming signatures. The analysis was methodical. The conclusions were precise. The result was a training manual, How to Fight the B-52. That document would prove to be one of the most lethal publications of the war. The Phoenix and the Dragon, Nixon's War. By 1972, everything had changed. Richard Nixon sat in the White House, elected partly on a promise to end the war with peace with honor. Defense Secretary Melvin Laird had implemented Vietnamization, withdrawing American ground troops and transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. Only 65,000 American troops remained in South Vietnam, down from a peak of over 500,000. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, had been conducting secret negotiations with North Vietnamese diplomat Le Duc Tho in Paris since 1969. The talks proceeded with glacial slowness, each side maneuvering for advantage, neither willing to concede fundamental positions. Then, on March 30th, 1972, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive. Under cover of darkness, 30,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars, supported by Soviet T-54 tanks, 130mm artillery, and anti-aircraft batteries poured across the DMZ in the largest conventional military operation since the Korean War. The objective was clear: seize as much South Vietnamese territory as possible before Nixon could respond, demonstrate the futility of Vietnamization, and force America to accept a settlement on Hanoi's terms. Nixon's response was immediate and overwhelming. On April 5th, he authorized Operation Freedom Train, the resumption of heavy bombing north of the DMZ using B-52s for strategic strikes against North Vietnamese infrastructure. For the first time since November 1968, the full weight of American air power fell on North Vietnam without the crippling restrictions of Rolling Thunder. 3 days later, on April 8th, B-52s struck targets near Vinh. 145 miles south of Hanoi. The North Vietnamese response was equally immediate. SA-2 missiles launched toward the bomber formations. One missile found its mark, damaging a B-52D but not destroying it. The wounded bomber limped south and landed at Da Nang Air Base. The message was clear: the sanctuary was over. B-52s operating over North Vietnam would be hunted. On May 8th, Nixon escalated further, ordering Operation Linebacker I. For the first time, B-52s attacked targets around Hanoi and Haiphong. The bombers struck rail yards, storage facilities, and the transportation network linking North Vietnam to its Chinese supply lines. Navy aircraft mined Haiphong Harbor, sealing it to Soviet supply ships. Tactical fighters and fighter bombers roamed across North Vietnam with new weapons, laser-guided bombs, and electro-optical guided munitions that transformed dumb iron bombs into precision instruments. The results were dramatic. North Vietnamese logistics ground toward paralysis. The Eastern offensive stalled as supplies dried up. Rail lines were severed. Bridges collapsed. Petroleum stocks burned. By October 1972, Le Duc was ready to negotiate seriously. On October 8th, he presented Kissinger with terms that seemed reasonable: a ceasefire in place, withdrawal of remaining American forces, return of American prisoners of war, and the promise of future elections to determine Vietnam's political future. Crucially, the agreement did not require North Vietnamese forces to withdraw from South Vietnam. Kissinger was elated. On October 26, he held a press conference and famously declared, "Peace is at hand." He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, who had been excluded from the secret negotiations, immediately recognized the fatal flaw. The agreement allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in South Vietnam while requiring American forces to leave. It was, in effect, a death sentence for his government, simply delayed by a few years. Thieu refused to sign. Kissinger, realizing he had overreached, returned to Paris to renegotiate. Le Duc, though, sensing American desperation, began demanding new concessions. The talks stalled. Days turned into weeks. By mid-December, negotiations had collapsed completely. Nixon faced a political crisis. The new Congress, elected in November, would be sworn in on January 3, 1973. This Congress was even more hostile to the war than its predecessor. If Nixon did not secure an agreement before then, Congress would likely cut off all funding for military operations in Vietnam. America's credibility and Nixon's political survival hung in the balance. On December 14, 1972, Nixon made his decision. In a meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his instructions were blunt and unequivocal. "I don't want any more of this crap about the fact that we couldn't hit this target or that one. This is your chance to use military power to win this war, and if you don't, I'll consider you responsible." The order went out to Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Command in Honolulu, and then down the chain of command to 7th Air Force Headquarters at Tan Son Nhut Air Base near Saigon, and to Strategic Air Command's bomber units. You are to commence at approximately 1200 Zulu, December 18, 1972, a 3-day maximum effort, repeat maximum effort, of B-52/tactical airstrikes in the Hanoi/Haiphong areas. Object is maximum destruction of selected targets. Expect maximum hostile reaction. Be prepared to extend operations past 3 days. If directed, maximum effort, maximum destruction, maximum hostile reaction. 3 phrases that would define 11 days of combat unlike anything seen in modern warfare. Strategic Air Command Headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, received Nixon's order with what can only be described as institutional surprise. Despite 8 years of bombing operations in Southeast Asia, despite the ongoing Linebacker I campaign, despite clear intelligence about the sophistication of North Vietnamese air defenses around Hanoi, SAC had no contingency plan for a sustained strategic bombing campaign against heavily defended targets. The planning that followed would prove catastrophically flawed. SAC's operational experience came primarily from arc-light missions, interdiction operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and close air support for ground forces in relatively benign threat environments. These missions follow standardized patterns refined over 8 years. Bombers approached at medium altitude, 20,000 to 30,000 feet, flew in trail formation, one cell behind another, attacked from predictable directions, and executed post-target turns to the right, a nuclear release procedure designed to protect bombers from atomic blast effects. For arc-light operations targeting jungle supply routes, these tactics caused no particular problems. North Vietnamese air defenses in the southern Panhandle and Laos were sparse and poorly coordinated. But Route Pac 6, the section of North Vietnam encompassing Hanoi and Haiphong, was an entirely different battlefield. The planned SAC produced for Linebacker II was a masterpiece of bureaucratic inflexibility. Because President Nixon had stipulated a 3-day operation based on political, not military considerations, SAC planners worked backward from that deadline to determine force composition and tactics. The result involved several critical tactical restrictions. All bombers would approach Hanoi at night to minimize make-fighter threat. All bombers would attack in 3 waves to maximize pressure. All waves would use identical approach paths to simplify planning and execution. All bombers would fly at the same altitude, 31,000 to 33,000 feet, standard arc-light altitude. All cells will fly in trail formation, stacked in time rather than space. All bombers would execute post-target turns to the right after weapons release, standard SAC procedure. These decisions were made for operational convenience, not tactical effectiveness. They transformed 129 aircraft flying a complex mission into a predictable pattern that North Vietnamese defenders could anticipate and exploit. The problems were immediately apparent to experienced combat aircrews. When Major Bill Stalker and the other bomber crews assembled for the initial briefing at Andersen Air Force Base on December 17th, the briefing officer projected a map on the screen. The scale was such that the map showed only 2 syllables, HA on one side of a city, NOE on the other. The briefing room fell silent. Then someone said what everyone was thinking, Hanoi. The silence gave way to nervous conversation. As one pilot, Captain Robert Jacober, later recalled, dramatic and impressive, yes. Scared, yes. Eager, yes. Captain John Strickland, who would fly 6 of the 11 Linebacker, 2 missions, studied the mission profile with growing alarm. The predictable routes, the identical altitudes, the rigid post-target turns, all of it violated basic tactical principles. During the Day 2 pre-mission briefing, his frustration boiled over. Who is planning such stupid tactics? Strickland demanded, and why? The briefer's response was as revealing as it was damning. The planning is being done at Omaha's SAC HQ and the common routes. Altitudes and trail formations are necessary to simplify planning within the 3-day timeframe. Translation: bureaucratic convenience trump crew survival. The post-target turn deserves particular attention because it would directly cause multiple B-52 losses. After releasing their bombs over Hanoi, bombers executed a standard right turn to escape the target area. This turn had 2 catastrophic consequences. First, the bombers turned directly into a 120-knot jet stream headwind. On the bomb run, this same jet stream had provided a 120-knot tailwind, giving the bombers a ground speed approaching 600 miles per hour. After the turn, ground speed dropped to under 350 miles per hour, a combined reduction of nearly 250 knots. The bombers essentially hung motionless in the sky relative to their bomb run speed, extending their time in the most dangerous airspace over Hanoi by critical minutes. Second, the turn pointed the emitter antennas of the B-52's electronic warfare systems away from the SA-2 radar sites they were jamming. B-52s defended themselves by broadcasting powerful jamming signals that disrupted the Phantom radar guidance systems of SA-2 missiles. But these jammers, located in the bomber's tail, worked most effectively when pointed at the threat. The post-target turn rotated the bomber's largest radar cross-section toward the missile sites, while simultaneously degrading their jamming effectiveness. It was the equivalent of turning your back on an armed enemy while simultaneously taking off your body armor. Furthermore, the predictable route and identical approach patterns meant that North Vietnamese air defense commanders knew exactly where the bombers would be at any given time. MiG-21 fighters flew parallel to the bomber formations, just as German fighters had done to Allied bombers over Europe in World War II. radioing speeds, altitudes, and headings back to missile sites. SA-2 batteries positioned themselves along projected flight paths and at the predictable turn points. Colonel John Chaser, a Navy pilot who flew 197 combat missions during the Vietnam War, later summarized the tactical situation. In 1972, the North Vietnamese had a very effective and multi-layered air defense system. The massive amount of firepower unleashed at the B-52s was at a level never seen since World War II, and never seen again since then. The surface-to-air missiles and radars they had were highly capable for that time period. They had a multitude of SAMs spread out, but mostly concentrated near the B-52's targets. Especially significant was that these SAM sites were manned with many highly trained and capable Soviet specialists. Assisting the North Vietnamese, the Cold War Soviets were extremely interested in testing their frontline air defense systems in a real World War environment. One final element completed the trap: operational security, or rather, its complete absence. Every B-52 bombing mission was preceded by a surge of detectable activity: logistics flights, ordnance loading operations, weather reconnaissance flights, aerial refueling tanker deployments. Even if the content of communications was encrypted, the pattern was unmistakable. Additionally, nearly all radio communications for U.S. air operations used unencrypted tactical voice communications. The North Vietnamese always knew when the bombers were coming. Often, they knew where they were going. Before Linebacker II even began, Hanoi's leadership issued a February 1965 directive that remained in effect 7 years later: maintain communication and transportation and expect the complete destruction of the entire country, including Hanoi and Haiphong. The communist leadership declared a people's war against the air war of destruction. Each citizen is a soldier, each village, street, and plant a fortress on the anti-American battlefront. All non-essential personnel had been evacuated from Hanoi. Those who remained, soldiers, missile crews, anti-aircraft gunners, and support personnel, were dug in, ready, and waiting. The trap was set. The bait was irresistible. 34 high-value targets in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. The hunters were patient, skilled, and motivated. And on the evening of December 18, 1972, the prey flew straight into the killing zone. Rosell approached Hanoi at 32,000 feet. Major Bill Stocker, leading from the left seat of Rose 1, watched his instruments with the practiced calm of a veteran airman. Behind him, spread across hundreds of miles, 98 more B-52s converged on North Vietnam's capital in 3 carefully synchronized waves. At 7:54 p.m. local time, the electronic warfare aircraft began their jamming. 4 Phantoms had laid chaff corridors. F-111s had struck the airfields. Everything was proceeding according to plan. And then, the North Vietnamese air defense network came fully alive. Captain Bob Surton, flying one of the first B-52s to penetrate Hanoi's defenses, saw them first. Telephone poles with lights spiraling around them, rising from the ground with impossible speed. SA-2 guideline missiles, each carrying a 288-pound fragmentation warhead, capable of shooting to altitudes of 60,000 feet at over 3 times the speed of sound. The missiles illuminated the entire night sky. Crews described them as the most beautiful and terrible thing you've ever seen. White-hot rocket motors trailing fire, spinning slowly as they climbed. Their radar guidance systems locked onto the massive radar returns of B-52s at 32,000 feet. The first wave struck targets at Kep, Phu Yen, and Hoa Lac airfields, plus a warehouse complex at Yên Vien. The second and third waves attacked targets around Hanoi itself. The bombing was accurate. The North Vietnamese would later admit that damage to their facilities was severe, but accuracy came at a price. 68 surface-to-air missiles launched during the first night. 3 found their targets. At 8:11 p.m., a missile detonated near Charcoal Cell's lead aircraft, a B-52G from Anderson. The bomber staggered in the sky, its hydraulic systems destroyed, electrical power gone. The aircraft commander and co-pilot fought for control using the aircraft's mechanical backup systems, but the bomber was mortally wounded. 3 crew members ejected and became prisoners of war. 3 others died. 13 minutes later, another SA-2 exploded. near Peach Sail's lead bomber. This crew was more fortunate, or perhaps more skilled. The pilot kept control long enough to cross into Thailand before ordering the crew to bail out. All 6 crew members survived and were rescued. At 8:32 p.m., an F-111 aardvark on a mission to destroy Radio Hanoi's broadcasting facilities was struck and went down. The crew did not survive. 2 B-52D models limped back to Untouchable Air Base in Thailand with heavy battle damage, hydraulic lines severed, control surfaces shot through, fuselages punctured by shrapnel. Back at Anderson Air Force Base and Untouchable, the returning crews were subdued. Captain Robert Jacober, who had flown in the second wave, described the return flight: a quiet, subdued, introspective trip. Ground crews who had watched the bombers depart counted them as they landed, wondering where the missing were. The briefing rooms were tense. 3 aircraft lost on the first night, a loss rate of 3%. If that rate held for 3 more days, the campaign would cost America 20 B-52s and 120 aircrewmen. For a strategic air command that had grown comfortable with the relatively benign threat environment of arc-light operations, it was a brutal awakening. The second night was both better and worse. 93 B-52s launched against targets including the Kin No Railroad Yards, the Yin Vien Transportation Complex, and the Tai Nguyen Thermal Power Plant. The bombing was again accurate. North Vietnamese industry and infrastructure buckled under the weight of high explosives. No B-52s were lost. Numerous aircraft sustained damage, shrapnel holes, severed hydraulic lines, shattered cockpit glass, blown tires. But every bomber that flew on night 2 returned to base. The reprieve was temporary and misleading. What the Americans didn't realize was that the North Vietnamese missile inventory was finite. Hanoi had expended 68 missiles on night 1, a massive expenditure that reflected both the intensity of their response and the limitations of their supply chain. Night 2 saw fewer launches, not because American tactics had improved, but because the North Vietnamese were conserving their remaining missiles and studying American patterns. And those patterns were becoming increasingly clear. The bombers came from the same directions. They flew at the same altitudes. They attacked in trail formations, one cell following another at predictable intervals. Most critically, they executed the same post-target turns that slowed them down and degraded their defensive systems at exactly the moment when they were most vulnerable. In air defense command centers scattered around Hanoi and Haiphong, North Vietnamese officers annotated maps and updated firing solutions. Soviet advisors analyzed jamming frequencies and radar returns. Missile crews conducted rehearsals, practicing engagement profiles against the expected American approach routes. The mathematics of interception were straightforward. If a bomber approached from bearing X at altitude Y with speed Z, and if it executed a post-target turn at coordinates A, then a missile launched from position B at time C would arrive at the precise intersection of bomber and destruction. The North Vietnamese were transforming air defense into a science. Quill Cell never had a chance. The 3 B-52G models approached the Yin Vien Rail Complex at 31,000 feet, their bomb base full, their electronic warfare officers monitoring their defensive systems. The bombing run was textbook perfect. 36 500-pound bombs tumbled from each aircraft and disappeared into the darkness below. Then came the turn. The standard post-target turn to the right executed exactly as briefed, exactly as expected. The North Vietnamese missile crews had been waiting. 3 SA-2 missiles launched in rapid succession from sites positioned precisely at Quilt Cell's turn point. The missiles climbed through 20,000 feet, through 25,000 feet, still accelerating. At 30,000 feet, their proximity fuses detected the massive radar return of Quilt 3. The warhead detonated 30 feet from the B-52's fuselage. 300 pounds of high explosives and steel fragments traveled outward at over 2,000 feet per second. The bomber's thin aluminum skin provided no protection. Shrapnel severed hydraulic lines, punctured fuel tanks, shredded control surfaces. The aircraft's tail gunner, who sat in the most exposed position, was killed instantly. 2 engines caught fire. The pilot, whose name would later be recorded as Captain Glenn Johnson, fought for control as the B-52 began its death spiral. "We're hit," he transmitted. "Going down." 4 crew members managed to eject. They landed in North Vietnam and became prisoners of war. 2 crew members died with the aircraft when they crashed in a rice paddy 10 miles south of Hanoi. Shortly thereafter, Brass Cell, already struggling after becoming separated during their turn, found themselves alone and vulnerable. The loss of cell integrity meant the collapse of mutual support jamming, the overlapping electronic countermeasures that made it difficult for SA-2 radar systems to achieve target lock. Brass 2 took a direct hit. 3 crew members became POWs. 3 were killed. Minutes later, Orange Cell lost 1 aircraft over the target, Olive Cell lost 1 on the turn, Brown Cell lost another. In a period of less than 30 minutes, 6 B-52s were shot down over North Vietnam. It was the single highest loss rate for heavy bombers since World War II. The toll: 18 crew members killed or missing in action, 18 more now prisoners in Hanoi's prisons. At least 220 SA-2 missiles had been fired that night. The North Vietnamese had learned to concentrate their fire at the turn point, where the bombers were slowest, most predictable, and least defensible. The loss rate for Night 3 exceeded 6%, 1 bomber lost for every 16 aircraft that flew the mission. If the campaign continued at this rate, the B-52 force would be decimated before New Year's Day. In the officers' club at Andersen Air Force Base, the bomber crews gathered in small groups, voices tense, anger building. The word mutiny would later be used in exaggeration, but not by much. The crews knew that rigid tactics designed 7,000 miles away in Omaha were getting them killed. They demanded changes, loudly, persistently. Their voices finally reached the right ears. General John C. Meyer, Commander-in-Chief of Strategic Air Command, flew to Guam to assess the situation personally. He interviewed crews, reviewed radar footage, analyzed damage reports, and consulted with 8th Air Force commanders who had direct responsibility for the missions. The conclusion was unavoidable. SAC's standard tactics were suicidal over Hanoi. President Nixon ordered a 36-hour bombing halt over Christmas Day. Publicly, it was a humanitarian gesture, an offer of peace during the holiest day of the Christian calendar. Privately, it was operational necessity. The B-52 force needed time to adapt. General Meyer assembled his planning staff and 8th Air Force commanders for a comprehensive review. Every mission was dissected. Every loss was analyzed. Every assumption was questioned. The data was damning. Current tactical problems included post-target turns that created killing zones where North Vietnamese missiles concentrated. Trail formations allowed missile batteries to engage aircraft sequentially. Identical approach routes enabled preposition defenses. Predictable altitudes simplified missile firing solutions. B-52G model aircraft with older ECM, electronic countermeasures, gear were more vulnerable than B-52D models with updated jammers. Enemy capabilities included SA-2 missiles effective against predictable targets, MiG-21 fighters providing early warning and altitude information to missile crews, overlapping radar coverage making electronic warfare difficult, Soviet advisors providing technical expertise and tactical guidance, approximately 300 missiles remaining in inventory, down from 500 at start of campaign. Lessons from the first 3 nights showed that North Vietnamese defenses were most vulnerable when overwhelmed from multiple directions simultaneously. B-52D aircraft with updated ALT-6 jamming systems proved more survivable than B-52G aircraft with older ALT-28 systems. SAM sites were positioning themselves at predicted turn points. North Vietnamese forces were conserving missiles for optimal firing opportunities. Chaff corridors were effective but needed better coordination. Wild Weasel F-105G aircraft were successfully suppressing some SAM sites but needed better integration with bomber streams. 8th Air Force commanders, now given more operational control, produced new tactical guidance. The new tactical directives included eliminating post-target turns, with bombers to continue straight ahead after weapons release. Timing would be compressed with multiple waves attacking simultaneously from different directions. Altitudes would vary, some cells at 31,000 feet, others at 33,000 feet, staggering the pattern. Only B-52D models will be used over Hanoi, with better ECM, until B-52G models could be upgraded. Improved Wild Weasel integration meant F-105G aircraft would attack SAM sites immediately before bomber arrival. Better chaff corridor coordination meant wider and denser corridors. Direct attacks on SAM storage sites would deplete missile inventory. Feint tactics using diversionary flights would confuse defenders about main attack axis. The changes were fundamental, but implementation would take days. The bombers stood down on Christmas Day. Crews rested. Maintenance personnel worked around the clock upgrading B-52G electronic warfare systems. Intelligence officers studied updated target folders. In Hanoi, the North Vietnamese used the POS very differently. Trucks rolled through the night, transporting fresh SA-2 missiles from storage sites to firing batteries. Missile crews drilled on rapid-fire procedures. Soviet advisors analyzed American tactics and predicted likely changes. The Air Defense Command assumed, correctly, that the bombing would resume. Both sides prepared for the next round. Both sides knew it would be decisive. What happened on the night of December 26, 1972, represented one of the most dramatic tactical transformations in the history of aerial warfare. At 10 p.m. local time, the largest single B-52 strike of the war commenced. 78 bombers from Anderson attacked Hanoi simultaneously, not in 3 sequential waves, but in 4 parallel streams, converging from northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast. At the exact same moment, 42 additional B-52s struck Haiphong from 3 directions. 120 bombers attacking 2 target complexes in a compressed 15-minute window. It was the aerial equivalent of overwhelming force applied with surgical timing. The North Vietnamese air defense network, designed to engage sequential raids, found itself facing saturation. Radar operators watching their screens saw not a stream of targets arriving predictably over time, but a swarm of targets arriving from multiple azimuths simultaneously. The carefully calculated firing solutions, predicated on bombers arriving from known directions at known times, became instantly obsolete. SA-2 missiles launched in desperation rather than precision. Over 120 missiles fired that night, the highest expenditure of the entire campaign. But dispersion degraded effectiveness. Missiles that should have been concentrated against single cells now scattered across multiple targets. Electronic warfare officers reported being painted by multiple radar systems simultaneously, but none maintaining lock long enough to generate optimal firing solutions. The bombers pressed their attacks: the Hanoi storage area, the Van Dien Depot, the Gia Thuong complex, the Tai Nguyen rail yards. Bombs fell in concentrated patterns, obliterating targets with devastating efficiency. 2 B-52D models were lost. Both fell to missiles, both crews became POWs or KIA, but the loss rate dropped to 1.7%, less than 1/3 the catastrophic rate of Night 3. More significantly, the tactical advantage has shifted. The North Vietnamese air defense system, which had demonstrated such lethal efficiency during the first 3 nights, now struggled against an enemy that refused to be predictable. General Meyer and his planning staff had identified the North Vietnamese air defense's critical vulnerability. The missile supply was finite and irreplaceable. Soviet supply ships required weeks to travel from Black Sea ports to Haiphong harbor. Overland shipments from China were slower and more vulnerable to interdiction. Once expended, SA-2 missiles could not be quickly replaced. The mathematics were simple. If American bombers attacked at a rate faster than the North Vietnamese could resupply, the air defense network would collapse under the weight of its own ammunition consumption. The next 3 nights focused on a systematic campaign to destroy North Vietnam SAM infrastructure. Not just the launchers, but the storage depots, assembly facilities, and transportation network that sustained them. On December 27th, 99 30 B-52s struck the Trong Quang storage area and the Lang Dang SAM assembly facility. Wild Weasel F-105G aircraft, now fully integrated into the bomber streams, identified and destroyed radar sites immediately before the bombers arrived. The coordination was precise. Suppression aircraft would detect a radar emission, fire AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missiles to destroy the radar, or force it offline, and then the bombers would attack before the site could recover. The North Vietnamese fired fewer than 40 missiles that night. Two B-52s sustained damage, but both recovered successfully. December 28th, Night 10, saw the pattern repeated. Coordinated strikes against both primary targets and SAM support infrastructure. Missile launches declined to fewer than 30. No B-52s were lost. December 29th, the final night of Linebacker II, saw the air defense network effectively exhausted. Fewer than 20 SA-2 missiles launched. The few sites still capable of firing revealed their positions and were immediately attacked by wild weasels. B-52 struck their targets unmolested. Captain John Strickland, flying his sixth and final Linebacker II mission, described the final night. We could see Hanoi burning below us. SAM launches were sporadic, poorly coordinated. We completed our bomb run, turned for home, and realized we had just witnessed the death of North Vietnam's air defense network. The transformation was complete. In 11 days, American air power had evolved from predictable victim to overwhelming predator. The price had been terrible. 15 B-52s destroyed, 92 crew members killed or captured or missing. But the result was undeniable. On December 30th, 1972, at 6:59 a.m. Hanoi time, Operation Linebacker II officially ended. North Vietnam's leadership signaled its willingness to resume peace negotiations in Paris. The final accounting of Operation Linebacker II reads like a case study in the decisive application of air power, once political restrictions were lifted and tactical mistakes corrected. American forces committed 729 B-52 sorties, 741 planned, 12 canceled due to weather or mechanical issues. Fighter bomber and attack aircraft flew 1,274 sorties, 769 Air Force, 505 Navy and Marine. The total was 2,003 strike sorties. Supporting aircraft included 114 F-105G Wild Weasels, 72 Phantom Fighter Escorts, 48 EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft, 96 KC-135 tankers, plus search and rescue and command and control aircraft. Ordnance delivered included 15,237 tons dropped by B-52s, 75% of total, and 5,000 tons dropped by tactical aircraft, 25% of total, for a total of 20,237 tons of ordnance. Targets destroyed included 34 primary military targets struck, 1,600 military installations destroyed or heavily damaged, all major rail yards in the Hanoi-Haiphong area destroyed, 80% of electrical power generation capacity eliminated, 2/3 of petroleum storage and distribution network destroyed, 3 major airfields rendered non-operational, every major bridge connecting Hanoi to outside supply lines dropped, and approximately $500 million in infrastructure damage, according to CIA estimate. American losses included 15 B-52s destroyed, 10 over North Vietnam, 5 crashed in Laos or Thailand after battle damage, 4 F-111 aardvarks were destroyed, 5 other tactical aircraft were destroyed, 4s, A-7s, A-6s, 1 HH-53 rescue helicopter was destroyed, 1 EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft was destroyed, total 27 aircraft destroyed. Crew casualties included 33 B-52 crew members killed or missing in action. 33 B-52 crew members became prisoners of war, 26 B-52 crew members rescued, and 75 total airmen died supporting the operation. North Vietnamese expenditures included between 884 and 1,240 SA-2 missiles fired. Sources vary. 2/3 of total SAM inventory was expended. 34 B-52s claimed destroyed according to North Vietnamese figures, disputed by U.S. Actual U.S. Confirmed B-52 losses, 15, with possibly 7 to 12 more written off due to irreparable battle damage. Loss rates showed an overall B-52 loss rate of 2.06% of sorties flown. First 3 nights loss rate, 4.2%. Last 8 nights loss rate, 1.2%. Final 3 nights loss rate, 0%. The numbers tell the story of tactical evolution under combat pressure. When Strategic Air Command fought the war with predictable World War II era tactics, B-52 losses averaged 1 aircraft per 24 sorties. When 8th Air Force commanders adapted tactics to counter North Vietnamese defenses, losses dropped to 1 aircraft per 83 sorties during the final 3 nights. As the North Vietnamese missile inventory approached exhaustion, losses fell to 0. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic impact. The sterile statistics of loss rates and sortie counts obscure a darker reality. The men who fell from the sky into North Vietnamese captivity. The prison system in Hanoi, primarily hollow prison, known to American POWs as the Hanoi Hilton, received 33 new inmates during Linebacker II. They joined the hundreds of Americans already held captive, some for as long as 8 years. The treatment they received violated every article of the Geneva Conventions. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Pyle, a B-52 radar navigator shot down on Night 3, spent his first weeks in solitary confinement in a cell measuring 6 feet by 6 feet. No windows. A single dim bulb burning 24 hours a day. Interrogators demanded military information, propaganda statements, confessions of war crimes. Pyle's refusal earned him beatings with bamboo clubs and torture in stress positions that dislocated his shoulders. They wanted me to say we were targeting schools and hospitals, Pyle later testified. I told them we targeted military installations and infrastructure. They didn't like that answer. The torture sessions continued for days. Pyle held out. Eventually, recognizing his intransigence, his captors simply left him in the cell, a different kind of torture. Isolation, darkness, the uncertainty of whether he would ever see home again. Other POWs had similar experiences. Captain John Strickland, not the same Strickland who questioned the tactics, was shot down on Night 1. His interrogators focused on extracting tactical information about B-52 electronic countermeasures and bombing procedures. When he refused to cooperate, they subjected him to rope torture, binding his arms behind his back with ropes that cut off circulation and caused excruciating pain. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, Strickland later said. It was knowing that my information could be used to shoot down my friends. I'd rather die than give them that. The North Vietnamese captors recognized the propaganda opportunity. They paraded captured airmen before cameras, filming confessions and peace statements to broadcast internationally. Most POWs resisted initially, but sustained torture broke some. Those forced to participate carried guilt for years afterward, even though their fellow prisoners and their government understood they had endured beyond human limits. Of the 113 American POWs who died in captivity during the entire Vietnam War, 65 were tortured to death. The Vietnamese interrogators had one objective: extract propaganda value from captured Americans to support the narrative that the United States was committing war crimes against civilian populations. It was a lie. But under torture, some men eventually said what their captors wanted to hear. On January 2nd, 1973, exactly as predicted by Nixon and Kissinger, North Vietnamese negotiators returned to the Paris peace talks. The correlation with Linebacker II's conclusion was impossible to ignore. Whether the bombing forced North Vietnam to negotiate, as Nixon claimed, or whether North Vietnam had already decided to resume talks before the bombing began, as some historians argue, remains debated. What is not debated is the outcome. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The terms were nearly identical to the October Agreement that had collapsed 2 months earlier. Immediate ceasefire throughout Vietnam, withdrawal of all remaining U.S. forces within 60 days, return of all American prisoners of war, North Vietnamese forces allowed to remain in South Vietnam, future political settlement to be determined by the Vietnamese people. President Tu, still president of South Vietnam, reluctantly agreed to the terms only after Nixon promised continued American support, including renewed bombing if North Vietnam violated the ceasefire. It was a promise Nixon would not be able to keep. The POW release began immediately. Operation Homecoming brought 591 American prisoners home between February and April 1973. Among them were the 33 men shot down during Linebacker II. They returned to a country deeply divided about the war, to families who had aged years in months, to a military that honored their service but questioned the purpose for which they had suffered. Lieutenant Colonel John Fur, shot down on Night 3 and held for 6 weeks, spoke for many when he described his return. I kissed the ground at Travis Air Force Base and thanked God I was home. Then I looked around at the protesters and the news cameras and the political circus, and I realized that we hadn't won anything. We just stopped losing. He was right. The Paris Peace Accords were not peace. They were a pause. North Vietnam used the ceasefire to rebuild its forces, reopen supply lines, and prepare for final victory. South Vietnam, stripped of American support after Congress cut off military aid in 1974, fought on alone. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. South Vietnam ceased to exist. America's longest war ended in defeat, at least on the ground. But in the air, that was a different story. Operation Linebacker II forced fundamental changes to American strategic bombing doctrine, aircraft design, and tactical employment that would reshape military aviation for the next 50 years. The electronic warfare revolution came about because the vulnerability of B-52G aircraft with older ECM systems versus the survivability of B-52D aircraft with updated Alt-6 jamming equipment demonstrated that electronic warfare was no longer a supporting function. It was a survival requirement. After Linebacker II, all remaining B-52G and B-52H models received upgraded ALT-28 and later ALT-32 electronic countermeasure systems. Electronic warfare officers' training tripled in length and complexity. Integration of electronic attack aircraft, EA-6B Prowlers, EF-111 Ravens, became standard procedure for all strike packages. Development of standoff jamming capabilities to support formations from safer distances also occurred. Precision-guided munitions development accelerated. While B-52s continued to use dumb iron bombs during Linebacker II, tactical aircraft employ the new generation of laser-guided and electro-optical weapons with devastating effectiveness. The lesson was clear. Precision weapons reduced required sorties, minimized collateral damage, and achieved effects that mass bombardment couldn't match. This accelerated development of advanced targeting pods for accurate laser designation, GPS-guided joint direct attack munition, JDAM, systems, integration of precision weapons onto heavy bombers, and reduction in required weapons loads, 1 precision bomb versus 100 iron bombs. Suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD, became critical. The success of what we saw F-105G operations in the final nights of Linebacker II validated the concept of dedicated SEAD missions. But the missions also revealed critical vulnerabilities. F-105 Thunder Chiefs were aging aircraft approaching obsolescence. AGM-45 strike missiles had limited range and required aircraft to approach dangerously close to SAM sites. Integration between sea aircraft and strike packages needed better coordination. Post-Linebacker II developments included 4G Wild Weasel variant with improved radar detection systems, AGM-88 HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missile, with greater range and lethality, dedicated electronic attack squadrons permanently assigned to carrier air wings, and doctrine requiring SEAD suppression before strike aircraft entered defended airspace. Tactical flexibility became paramount. Perhaps the most important lesson: rigid, predictable tactics developed by staffs far from combat get aircrew killed. The transformation from SAC's inflexible approach to 8th Air Force's adaptive tactics saved lives and won the campaign. This fostered greater operational control delegated to theater commanders, emphasis on tactical variation and unpredictability, multi-axis time-compressed strike packages as standard procedure, and continuous tactical evolution based on enemy adaptation. B-52 modernization continued. The Stratofortress proved its worth over Hanoi, but also revealed its age. After Linebacker II, the B-52 underwent continuous upgrades. In the 1980s, integration of AGM-86 air-launched cruise missiles. In the 1990s, GPS navigation systems and improved avionics. In the 2000s, Link 16 data link and advanced targeting pods. In the 2010s, internal weapons bay upgrades for precision munitions. In the 2020s, new Rolls-Royce engines and complete avionics modernization. Expected service life through 2050 or beyond, making the B-52 potentially the first military aircraft to serve for a century. In Hanoi today, visitors to the Vietnam Military History Museum encounter a very different narrative of Linebacker II than Americans might expect. The museum's B-52 exhibition hall features 3 large video screens and an illuminated terrain map of 1972 Hanoi. A soundtrack of martial music, explosions, and anti-aircraft fire fills the space. The screens show surface-to-air missiles launching into night skies and B-52s tumbling earthward in flames. Flashing lights on the terrain map indicate where bombs fell and where aircraft crashed. The museum's label reads, "The 11 Days and Nights, How the People's Air Defense Forces Defeated American Air Piracy Over Hanoi." The Vietnamese narrative describes Linebacker II as Dien Bien Phu in the air, comparing it to the 1954 battle that ended French colonialism in Indochina. According to this version, the American bombing campaign was defeated by the courage of missile crews, the determination of anti-aircraft gunners, and the resilience of the Vietnamese people. The claim that 34 B-52s were destroyed, compared to the US acknowledgement of 15, supports the narrative of overwhelming victory. In the museum's courtyard, a pile of B-52 wreckage stands 20 feet high, twisted aluminum, shattered cockpit glass, sections of fuselage painted with US Air Force markings. Nearby, 2 SA-2 missiles sit on their launchers, a fan-song tracking radar points skyward, and a control van displays the equipment where Vietnamese missile crews tracked and engaged incoming bombers. Senior Colonel Nguyen Dinh King, who commanded an SA-2 battery during Linebacker II, provides the official Vietnamese assessment. The B-52 was America's ultimate weapon, a symbol of their technological superiority and military might. When we shot down 15 of them in the 11 days, we proved that determination and skill can overcome any technological advantage. We defended our capital. We broke their will. They left Vietnam 2 years later. Who won? Is a compelling narrative. It's also incomplete. The Vietnamese perspective emphasizes the tactical successes of shooting down American bombers while minimizing the strategic consequences of losing 2/3 of their air defense network, 80% of their electrical generation, their entire rail system around Hanoi, and hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure. Their narrative celebrates the courage of missile crews without acknowledging that by December 29th, those crews had almost no missiles left to fire. But Colonel Kin's fundamental point is not wrong. North Vietnam did defeat the United States, just not in the air over Hanoi in December 1972. That defeat came on the ground in South Vietnam in April 1975, when American political will finally collapsed and Congress refused to provide further support to Saigon. Linebacker II didn't lose the war, but it couldn't win it either. Half a century after the Christmas bombings, historians continue to debate what Operation Linebacker II actually accomplished. The perspectives divide along predictable lines. The military victory argument states that proponents argue that Linebacker II demonstrated the effectiveness of unrestricted strategic bombing when properly employed. By attacking the enemy's industrial capacity, transportation network, and military infrastructure without the crippling restrictions of Rolling Thunder, American air power achieved in 11 days what 3 years of graduated pressure could not, forcing North Vietnam to negotiate seriously. If Nixon had been allowed to conduct this campaign in 1965 instead of 1972, the argument goes, the war might have ended 7 years earlier with very different results. Air Force Colonel Robert Jacober, who flew 6 Linebacker II missions, articulated this view. We prove that when American air power is unleashed without political micromanagement, we can destroy any target, defeat any air defense, and impose our will on any enemy. The tragedy is that we learned this lesson after 8 years of doing it wrong. The strategic failure argument from critics contends that Linebacker II was tactically brilliant but strategically irrelevant. Yes, American bombers destroyed North Vietnamese infrastructure. Yes, the air defense network was effectively neutralized. But so what? The Paris Peace Accords signed in January 1973 were essentially identical to the October 1972 agreement that collapsed before Linebacker II began. The bombing didn't change North Vietnam's war aims, didn't prevent the ultimate conquest of South Vietnam, and didn't save the 58,000 Americans who died in a failed cause. Historian A.J. Languth wrote that the Christmas bombings were pointless because the final peace agreement was essentially the same as the one offered before the bombing commenced. John Negroponte, who participated in the Paris negotiations, was even more dismissive. We bombed them into accepting our concessions. The limited war paradox offers perhaps the most nuanced interpretation. It recognizes that Linebacker II proved both the potential and the limitations of air power in limited wars. Bombing can destroy infrastructure, can degrade military capabilities, can impose costs on an enemy, but bombing alone cannot break the will of a determined enemy fighting for objectives it considers existential. North Vietnam in 1972 was not Nazi Germany in 1945 or Imperial Japan facing atomic weapons. It was a poor agricultural society with limited industrial capacity and a population that had already endured decades of warfare. There simply weren't enough strategic targets to destroy, and the targets that existed could be dispersed, hidden, or rebuilt. More fundamentally, the North Vietnamese leadership was willing to accept any level of destruction to achieve reunification. Ho Chi Minh had famously declared, "You will kill 10 of our men, and we will kill 1 of yours. And in the end, it will be you who tire of it." Linebacker II changed the ratio, but not the underlying dynamic. Colonel John Cheshire, the Navy pilot who analyzed the campaign extensively, offered this assessment. Linebacker II taught us that technological superiority matters, that tactical flexibility is essential, that courage under fire is universal. It also taught us that air power has limits. You can't bomb an enemy into loving you, you can't bomb a guerrilla movement out of existence, and you can't bomb a political solution into being. Those lessons remain relevant today. In December 2022, on the 50th anniversary of Linebacker II, a small group of American veterans gathered at the Air Force Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. They were old men now, in their 70s and 80s, but the memories of those 11 nights remain vivid. Captain, retired Robert Jacober, who flew 6 missions and survived them all, described his emotions at the reunion. "We lost friends over Hanoi. We watched bombers fall from the sky. We flew through missile barrages that defied description. For years afterward, I had nightmares about the turn point, about the missiles coming up, about not making it home. But standing here with the guys who flew with me, I realized we accomplished something important. We did our duty, we brought most of our people home, and we demonstrated that American airmen, when properly led and properly supported, can overcome any challenge." Lieutenant Colonel retired Darrell Pyle, who spent 6 weeks as a POW after being shot down on night 3, had a different perspective. "I don't celebrate Linebacker II. I remember it. I remember the fear, the pain, the uncertainty. I remember my interrogators, and I remember my fellow POWs who didn't make it home. But I also remember that we followed orders, we executed our missions, and we maintained our honor even in captivity. That's what I'm proud of." The most poignant moment came when the veterans placed a wreath at the memorial, not in celebration of victory, but in remembrance of the 15 bomber crews who didn't return. 33 names on the memorial wall, 33 families forever incomplete, 33 stories that ended in the skies over Hanoi. Former B-52 pilot, Colonel, retired John Strickland, who questioned the tactics and lived to fly 6 missions, spoke for the group. "We were sent to do an impossible job under ridiculous restrictions with inadequate planning. We did it anyway. We adapted. We survived. And we learned lessons that the Air Force still teaches today. I'm proud of what we accomplished. I just wish we'd accomplished it smarter." Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, you'll find B-52 detail number 560665 on display. This particular aircraft flew combat missions during Linebacker II, sustained major battle damage from an SA-2 missile proximity detonation, limped back to Da Nang with 156 damaged areas across its fuselage, and was later repaired and returned to service. The placard beneath the aircraft reads, "From June 1965 to August 1973, B-52s operating from Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, Andersen AFB, Guam, and Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield. Thailand flew over 126,000 combat missions in Southeast Asia. During Operation Linebacker II in December 1972, B-52s proved their ability to survive in the most heavily defended airspace in history and deliver devastating strikes against enemy targets. If you travel to Hanoi and visit the Vietnam Military History Museum, you'll find pieces of this very same aircraft or aircraft very much like it, piled in the courtyard as trophies of Vietnamese victory. Two museums, two countries, two narratives, both claiming victory. Perhaps both are right, or perhaps neither. Stripped of nationalism, propaganda, and political spin, here is what Operation Linebacker II demonstrated. What succeeded, strategic bombing, when properly employed with tactical flexibility and without political micromanagement, can destroy an enemy's infrastructure. Electronic warfare, precision munitions, and suppression of enemy air defenses are not optional extras. They are survival requirements. Heavy bombers remain relevant in modern warfare if properly protected and tactically employed. American air crews, when properly led, can adapt under fire and overcome seemingly impossible challenges. What failed? Strategic bombing alone cannot win a limited war against a determined enemy fighting for existential objectives. Technological superiority, while important, is not decisive against an enemy willing to accept unlimited casualties. Political considerations will always constrain military operations in limited wars. Victory in the air does not automatically translate to victory on the ground. What endures? The men and women who flew those missions, who manned those missile sites, who fought in that war are dying now. The last Vietnam veterans are in their 70s and 80s. Within another generation, they will all be gone. The first-hand memories will fade into history books and documentary films. But the lessons endure. The B-52 continues to fly, upgraded, modernized, adapted for new threats. The tactics developed over Hanoi inform how America fights today. The recognition that air power has both immense potential and real limitations shapes modern military doctrine. And somewhere in a museum storage room, gathering dust, there is a Fansong radar unit that once tracked B-52s over Hanoi, and a piece of aluminum fuselage that once carried American airmen through a hail of missiles. They sit side by side now, victor and vanquished, hunter and hunted, or perhaps neither. Perhaps just artifacts of a war that nobody truly won. On December 29, 1972, at 6:59 a.m. Hanoi time, the last B-52 cleared North Vietnamese airspace. The bombers had flown 729 combat sorties. They had dropped 15,237 tons of ordnance. They had destroyed 34 major targets and hundreds of minor installations. They had lost 15 aircraft, and with them, 33 men killed or captured, 33 families forever changed. North Vietnam's industrial capacity lay in ruins. Its transportation network was severed. Its electrical grid was dark. Its air defense network had fired its last missiles. 2/3 of its SAM inventory was expended. By any objective military measure, North Vietnam had been defeated in the air. 2 years later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon and South Vietnam ceased to exist. This paradox, tactical brilliance producing strategic irrelevance, defines Operation Linebacker II's place in military history. It was the most intense, sophisticated, and ultimately successful strategic bombing campaign since World War II. It was also pointless, because the war it was meant to win had already been lost, not in the air over Hanoi, but in the rice paddies of South Vietnam, in the halls of Congress, in the streets of American cities where protesters demanded an end to the killing. But if Linebacker II didn't save South Vietnam, it did transform American air power. The rigid, predictable tactics that caused 6 B-52s on Night 3 gave way to flexible, adaptive operations that suffer 0 losses by campaign's end. This transformation, from bureaucratic inflexibility to tactical innovation, accomplished under fire in days rather than years, became the foundation of modern air warfare doctrine. The recognition that electronic warfare is not supporting function but survival requirement drove decades of investment in jamming systems, stealth technology, and cyber warfare capabilities. The integration of precision weapons, suppression of enemy air defenses, and real-time tactical adaptation created the playbook that would dominate American air operations in every conflict since. Desert Storm in 1991, Allied Force in 1999, Enduring Freedom in 2001, Iraqi Freedom in 2003, and continuing operations in the Middle East today. The B-52 itself, designed in the 1940s, built in the 1950s, tested over Hanoi in the 1970s, continues to fly. It has outlived its intended replacement, the Boeing Lancer. It will outlive its replacement's replacement, the B-2 Spirit. Current planning anticipates B-52s remaining in service through 2050 or beyond, making it potentially the first military aircraft to serve for a century. But perhaps the most important legacy is humility. Linebacker II taught the United States military that technological superiority matters, but it's not sufficient. That courage matters, but cannot overcome political constraints. That winning battles does not automatically mean winning wars. That limited wars impose limits even on the world's most powerful military. These lessons were forgotten in Iraq. They were forgotten in Afghanistan. Perhaps they will be forgotten again in future conflicts. But they remain true, carved in the aluminum wreckage, scattered in North Vietnamese rice paddies, and memorialized in the names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The last word belongs to Senior Colonel Nguyen Dinh Kinh, the Vietnamese missile commander, who provided perhaps the most honest assessment when asked who won the battle over Hanoi in December 1972. You Americans won the battle. You destroyed our missiles, our infrastructure, our industrial capacity. Your bombers flew home. Our cities burned. By any military measure, you won. But we won the war. We outlasted you. We remained in our country. You left. In the end, that is the only victory that matters. He paused, then added, but I respect the American airmen who flew those missions. They were skilled, they were courageous, and they adapted when their leaders made mistakes. In another war, at another time, perhaps we could have been friends rather than enemies. The men fighting rarely choose the wars. They simply do their duty. On December 18th, 1972, Captain Bob Certain climbed into his B-52G and flew toward Hanoi. Uncertain whether he would return, he did return. So did most of the men who flew those 11 nights. They did their duty. They demonstrated that American air power, properly employed, could overcome any defense and achieve any objective, except the one objective that mattered, winning the war. That lesson, perhaps more than any tactical innovation or technical advancement, remains Operation Linebacker II's most enduring legacy. The B-52s flew home, the prisoners came home, the war ended, and Vietnam remained Vietnam. For the 33 men who fell from the sky over Hanoi in December 1972, for the Vietnamese families who endured the bombing, for all who fought in the war nobody won, this is their story.